Syria. It is a conflict I didn't want to be talking about in 2020. I first um, talked and studied the conflict back in 2011. I was teaching in New Orleans at the time, and the local news organizations were trying to find people who specialized in conflict and political institutions. And so I had a number of opportunities to get on TV and try to ruminate about what I was seeing in Egypt, in Tunisia, and in Syria, and trying to not be overwhelmed by the optimism of the winds of change and to be realistic about the kind of structural background conditions that we talk about in this class. And Syria was one of those cases that me and a lot of other international relations scholars and conflict scholars were worried about because of um, the nature of the leadership, the nature of the country, and the position that it held, as well as the recent history of conflicts and political change in neighboring countries. And in 2020, you now have a conflict that, by and large, the world has forgotten or stopped talking about. Um, you have estimates that between 380,000 and 580,000 people have died since 2011, and a country has been, a large swath of it, destroyed, and millions of people either internally displaced or moved abroad. I used it as an example in my Paul's 1005 Introduction to International Relations class because that conflict in the years since 2011 has involved so many different types of conflict, different types of actors in it that you can teach or discuss or argue about pretty much any kind of area that you want to focus on. If you're interested in interventions from international actors, you have that. If you have neighboring instability, you have that. You have different kinds of religious conflicts, neighboring economic factors, just anything, environmental factors, basically anything that you can think of is or has been involved in the Syrian conflict. For those of you, the videos go in a bit about it, but yeah, these statistics are a bit out of date, but the number of different actors in the country are huge. The civilians, as of 2011, there was 23 million. UN estimates 6.6 internally displaced, 4.7 million refugees, more than 125,000 killed. I haven't updated that number. Armed non-state groups, there's a bunch of different ones. The Kurdish forces and opposition forces in the north. Others that were more important, like ISIS a couple of years ago, are less important now. And government forces, U.S., U.K., France, Turkey, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah. A Russian major general was just killed there in recent weeks. I saw videos online of U.S. and Russian troops almost having a traffic accident in the area. U.S. and Russian jets have engaged in quite close contact in the air over the Syrian conflict, and so you have a bunch of different actors, all with their own agendas, all with their own interests, and then you have civilians who often pay the price that are displaced either within the country or across. Syria, I think, is an interesting case in which you had the Iraq War in 2003. You actually had Syria as a stable neighboring country take in a lot of Iraqi refugees. By the end of 2003, there was 70 to 100,000 Iraqis. By 2009, the estimated population was over a million. and so they've been those people since the outbreak of conflict for worrying about whether they're potential supporters of Assad. They've been targeted. Some of them have fled back over the border. But you had refugees from one conflict moving to another country that was stable, and then that country ends up falling apart. So you have interesting tensions for people trying to find a place that's stable, and that changes over time. A couple of recent events in the Syrian conflict, before we talk about the environmental factors that are relevant, is basically there's been a lot of effort at trying to have peace agreements. Peace talks in Kazakhstan in 2017 led to a ceasefire. Turkey then launched an attack to oust Kurdish rebels. Syrian army was not doing too well in the early years until they got foreign assistance, most importantly from the Russian military that's been able to recapture a large part of territory in recent years. ISIS territory that used to be quite sizable within the areas basically was stamped out as well. The Kurdish SDF launched an offensive in September 2018 to take over that ISIS-held territory. Then President Trump planned to remove troops in January of 2019, warning Turkey to not go in and to try to go after the Kurdish forces, who Turkey attributes causing instability on the Turkish side of the border for going back to the 90s. However, once the U.S. started withdrawing, the Turkish military did go in and attack the Kurdish forces, who had been U.S. allies for the better part of a decade. The Trump administration decided to not withdraw all their troops. I think the U.S. has around 400 troops in Syria at the moment. And the U.S. also conducts regular airstrikes, killed the head of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, also in 2019. In 2020, there really hasn't been widespread change of territory. Idlib was in contention, but you can see in the maps there's been a relatively stable division, with the government having most of the territory. One of the articles that I used back when I taught this in 2016 was how Russia was moving in October to try to take advantage of the preoccupation in the U.S. with the U.S. election. Now that we're in the last push towards the U.S. election in 2020, as a critical IR scholar, it makes me think about whether people would take advantage of that after or in these last days leading up to the U.S. election. Even Joe Biden, before he became vice president, was saying that presidents are often tested in those first 100 days. But you can also see that governments try to take advantage of a situation before things change. Part of the reason why some IR scholars think that Israel and UAE came out with the agreement that they had made now was because they had a strong U.S. support with the Trump administration now, and there's some worry about whether a Democratic president might be less supportive of the Netanyahu government in Israel. So people make decisions both for conflict as well as for peace in light of what might happen with changes of leadership in areas that they depend in for support. The U.S. Congressional Research Service generates reports for the U.S. Congress. These are some of the most up-to-date maps that I could find to see how the fighting is actually going on in the ground. On the ground. So this is one I downloaded back in 2017, in which you can see the Islamic State in the dark gray or the black, how much territory they held at that time, and the white areas were just areas in which you didn't have a strong basis of control for either the government's forces in green, or the opposition forces in blue or in yellow, that it was kind of a patchwork. Fast forward to 2020, and you see much more of a long-term sustainable division of territory between the government forces that have taken over a lot of territory in the south and central parts of the country, while the opposition held areas are in the periphery along the border and in the north. So you see a change in territory, a hardening and strengthening of government forces, while the slow attrition that's led to civilian deaths of internally displaced people, as well as people in the urban areas, continue to this day, pretty much. When talking about the onset of the conflict, you can make a lot of really interesting arguments about how the environment has been changed after the conflict has begun. But Syria is one of those examples that people like to mention of how an environmental drought led to the onset of the conflict, dating back. This initial press report got in the New York Times from the 2015 publication of this article here, as well as a few others that tried to track how bad this drought that had happened in Syria in the years before the 2011 conflict. Another one in 2016 looked at tree rings as a way to look at drought going back over time, and they found that the drought in the 5 years before the outbreak of the war had been the worst in 900 years. And so there's really an amazing amount of different academics gathering information on different things that you and I probably would never think of, to try to look at how the world has changed over time. So they looked at these different areas for the tree ring chronologies and the drought. You can get other kind of measures of drought over time. You saw from 1980 to 2012 how the drought areas had gotten worse in Greece, Syria, Morocco, and elsewhere. And you just see over on the right hand side of these measures from that same article from 2016 that the drought had just gotten a lot worse in those recent years. In the Levant, that was even more dramatic than in the Western Mediterranean or in Greece. Now, this is part of a larger puzzle, and as we've seen over the course of the semester, environmental factors are but one part of the larger puzzle for understanding conflict. And a lot of the readings that we've done in this class have talked about how environmental conditions often are relevant when they intersect with other political or cultural or social dynamics within a country, that environmental factors that by themselves are not really sufficient conditions. This article in Political Geography came out kind of making that more skeptical case. Colin Hendricks responded to that. So you see these dynamics in the literature. There's still disagreement about the relative importance of environmental factors versus political leadership, all these other factors that we've covered so far in this class in trying to explain conflict. And so you have one particular case that's overdetermined by the number of potential causes, the number of potential relevant actors. And so what we have to do is either look at general patterns between these different factors, as we've done, or you can drill down to a specific case and then try to make relative arguments for how important different factors were, or to look at the specific case in detail to kind of see how they play out over time. But it's all comes down to theory, about argument, about evidence, and how compelling the story is for trying to explain a particular outcome. The drought narrative in the Syrian conflict was relevant, and people did research looking at how people moved from rural areas during the drought. It no longer became possible to sustain people, so they moved to the cities, and that created pressures in the cities, as well as people who, when there was a reason to protest and hit the streets, more people were around, and the opportunity costs were lower. So it's a multi-stage kind of story, but one that we can look at a bunch of different cases and see how environmental factors intersect with a lot of these more political or economic parts of the state to try to understand conflict. I think when you have this debate about the importance of drought, we often focus in this class on describing what actually happened or trying to explain why it happened in a particular way. But I'm interested to think about your perspective on policymaking as a way to kind of get us to think about how there are implications for thinking one story is more compelling to explaining a conflict or another, and also to get us thinking about different policymakers that are relevant to specific conflict. We're going to touch on them in weeks 11 and week 12. So for the last lecture question, my question is, what are the implications policy-wise for deciding that the drought did or did not contribute to the Syrian civil war's onset? Does it matter? I guess. So theoretically, it could be an interesting question that might motivate you, but do you think there's real policy implications for understanding how drought might have led to the conflict? Does it have an implication for Syria, for the current conflict, or for rebuilding the conflict afterwards, or for other areas that might be going through similar droughts that are becoming more common over time? So that's the third question, and that's basically a couple of parts of the larger Syrian puzzle and links to the overall theories, the motivating questions in today. How does the movement of people have an effect on human security and conflict? What types of migrants there are, why they move, what links there are to conflict, and how it can be difficult to make a kind of direct causal claim about environmental factors leading to these kind of conflicts that we look at in this class. And yeah, policymaking is one of those things that we don't talk about extensively. It's not the focus, but that is also going to be relevant later on in the class. So a lot. Thank you for bearing with me through today. I know that there's a lot going on, so hopefully you are able to take a bit of a break before we come back and start talking about other kind of links between environmental factors, human security, and conflict. See you guys later.